Hello, this is Professor James Strickler. This is a course in American government. This lesson from Unit 12 about the Georgia Constitution. It's Lesson 2, where we have a second lesson about Georgia history. In this lesson, you'll learn about the cotton gin. You'll learn about the Georgia Gold Rush and Indian removal. You'll learn about secession and Civil War, and about the readmission of Georgia to the Union. In these first three lessons of this unit, we're going to have an overview of Georgia history. The first lesson concerned the founding era, and then we have a lesson through the Civil War, and then a lesson about Georgia history after the Civil War. This lesson will cover the time period from the founding up through the Civil War. The first big event from that time period we want to talk about is the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. Prior to its invention, while cotton was a crop that was being raised in Georgia, it was one that wasn't particularly economically profitable because it required so much labor to pick the cotton seeds out of the cotton. Once Eli Whitney had invented a device that could efficiently pick the cotton seeds out, then cotton became a very profitable cash crop. Cotton then became the king of agriculture across the South, including in the state of Georgia, which then allowed for the plantation economic system to really take root, which led to the expansion of slavery in the state. By the time of the Civil War arrived, the population of the state of Georgia was 45% slaves, nearly half of the population made up of people who were in bondage. At the same time that Georgia's slave population was growing, another population was receding, and that was Native Americans. The big thing that happened besides disease that drove Native Americans out of the picture in Georgia was the Georgia Gold Rush. During this time period, what happened was gold was discovered on lands that were possessed by the Cherokee Indian tribe. The Cherokees didn't want to allow white men on their lands to dig up the gold. Well, they wanted on there anyway, and a dispute followed. The dispute ended up going all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where the Cherokee tribe won. They were told that this was their land by treaty with the United States, and they could decide what would be done with it, rather than white gold miners coming in and taking it over from them. Well, despite their victory in the Supreme Court, Andrew Jackson, a man who notoriously hated Indians, pushed through a law through Congress. He was the President of the United States at the time. Pushed through a law called the Indian Removal Act. And that he used the authority from that to then forcibly relocate the Cherokee tribe and other Native American tribes out of the southern United States to the Indian Territory that had been set up in Oklahoma. The Cherokees' removal from Georgia and march all the way to Oklahoma became known as the Trail of Tears. So because gold was discovered on their lands and the white majority wanted to get that gold, eventually these Native Americans and other American Indians from the area were relocated to Oklahoma. So we had the black population in Georgia rising because of the productivity of cotton and the use of slaves in harvesting it. And at that same time, the population of American Indians fell dramatically as they were forcibly removed to Oklahoma. The next big event in Georgia history that we want to talk about is the American Civil War, which took place from 1861 to 1865. Now, we know from previous lessons that this was fought over the issue of slavery, whether or not the South could continue that institution even as the Republican Party took power in Washington. They were afraid that eventually it would be outlawed, so they decided to break away from the Union. Among the states that seceded or broke away from the Union was the state of Georgia. You can see it here marked on this map in pink along with the other states that seceded. Well, these states that seceded from the Union eventually had to fight a war over what they had done, as the North fought to keep them in the Union. In the short story of it is, which we've covered previously in this course, is that the Southern states lost the Civil War. The national government, the Union Army, the Northern states, they won the war. Now, in this victory for the North, in one particular way, Georgia was particularly brutalized. And that was by General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea. He cut a path through northern Georgia where he basically destroyed everything in his path. He burned buildings, he tore up road lines, he cut telegraph lines. He tried to do not just defeat Georgia, but devastate Georgia. After Georgia and the other southern states eventually surrendered to the northern armies, they were occupied by the northern military. I shouldn't say the northern military, the U.S. military. In a very important sense, as we've talked about previously in this course, the Civil War was a war between the states and the national government. So the Army of Georgia and the other southern states was defeated by the United States Army and then occupied thereafter. And then in a slow process, these states were brought back into the Union. But it wasn't until 1870 that this process was completed. The reason it was so slow to bring them back was because they were required by the United States Congress to accept certain amendments that were being added to the Constitution before the Congress would agree to seat the elected people from Georgia in the House of Representatives or the Senate. So while Georgia might elect a senator, the Senate would refuse to have that person seated until Georgia had approved all these amendments. So while Georgia was allowed to start functioning as a state again locally, it couldn't really participate fully in the national system until it had ratified these amendments. Those amendments collectively are known as the Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which we've talked about a couple of times previously in this course. Let me just remind you what's in them. The 13th Amendment ended slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment provides a list of things that states are no longer allowed to do, such as we've talked about in detail in this course, not depriving someone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and being required to give equal protection to people within their state. The 15th Amendment then prohibited states from depriving the right to vote to people on account of race. So these three amendments were designed to, first of all, free the slaves, and then ensure that the states would treat them in a fundamentally equal way, at least legally, and then to make sure that the newly freed slaves and their descendants would be allowed to vote. It wasn't until 1870 that Georgia actually ratified these amendments and then was fully accepted back into the Union by being allowed to have representation in Congress. Georgia was actually the last of the former Confederate states that was willing to go through these steps to be readmitted to the Union. All right, let's review what we learned in this lesson. What invention transformed the Southern economy? Was it refrigeration, the sewing machine, the cotton gin, or the telegraph? Now, please remember the time period that's being covered in this lesson. So, while refrigeration may have eventually had a big effect on the South as it allowed air conditioning, that wasn't something that happened yet. No, the right answer here for what transformed the Southern economy during the time period of this lesson is surely the cotton gin. What was the result of the Georgia Gold Rush? Was it that Georgia's population then doubled? Was it the free silver movement that came about after it? Was it the creation of a gold standard for the country? Or was it the Trail of Tears? The big result was the Trail of Tears. While the Georgia Gold Rush did find some gold, it wasn't nearly enough to really transform the nature of the state of Georgia, other than that it provided the excuse to remove the Native Americans from the state. What was Georgia's role in the Civil War? Did they secede from the Union? Were they a loyal slave state? Did they remain neutral? Or did they betray the Confederacy? Now, let me go loyal slave state and make sure you understand about that before you decide whether that's the right answer or not. What I mean is, were they a slave state that was loyal to the Union? No, Georgia was not loyal to the Union. It was one of the states that seceded from the Union. What was required for Georgia's readmission to the Union? Was it the election of Republicans? Was it full surrender? Was it loyalty oaths from its citizens? Or was it ratification of certain amendments? Georgia was required by the United States Congress to ratify the 3 Civil War amendments before it would be allowed to be readmitted to the Union. Now, what's interesting about this is that Georgia was completely coerced into ratifying these amendments. They didn't want to. They didn't want to change in the ways that those amendments required them to do. But they were forced to do it anyway, or they would have remained under military occupation. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 12. It'll be Lesson 3. It'll be our 3rd lesson about Georgia history. And it'll be the last lesson about Georgia history before we move on to talking about the Georgia Constitution.